Today is a tragic day for humanity, for the people of Iraq, for the people of the United States, and for the United Nations as an institution. It is also a tragic day for the future of our planet and for the children, 30,000 of whom in the Third World will starve to death today while we spend billions to wage this war, and 25% of whom live in poverty in our own country because we apparently lack the funds to provide them a minimal standard of living. I fear very much that what we said yesterday is that war and the enormous destructive power of our armed forces is our preferred manner for dealing with the very complicated and terrible crises in the Middle East. I fear that someday we will regret that decision and that we are in fact laying the groundwork for more and more wars in that region in years to come. Mr. Speaker, it is incumbent upon us to do everything in our power, now that the war has started, to prevent unnecessary bloodshed and to support our troops in the most basic way, by bringing them home alive and well. I urge my fellow members to ask the President to stop the bombing immediately and request that the Secretary General of the United Nations go to Iraq to begin immediate negotiations for the withdrawal of Iraq from Kuwait and the cessation of the war. Let us do everything in our power to stop unnecessary bloodshed. Thank you.
This is a very difficult vote. This is probably the hardest decision I've ever had to make. Any vote that might lead to war should be hard, but I cast it with conviction.
Mr. Speaker, in the brief time I have, let me give you 5 reasons why I'm opposed to giving the President a blank check to launch a unilateral invasion and occupation of Iraq, and why I will vote against this resolution. 1, I have not heard any estimates of how many young American men and women might die in such a war, or how many tens of thousands of women and children in Iraq might also be killed. As a caring nation, we should do everything we can to prevent the horrible suffering that a war will cause. War must be the last recourse in international relations, not the first. Second, I am deeply concerned about the precedent that a unilateral invasion of Iraq could establish in terms of international law and the role of the United Nations. If President Bush believes that the U.S. can go to war at any time against any nation, what moral or legal obligation could our government raise if another country chose to do the same thing? Third, the United States is now involved in a very difficult war against international terrorism, as we learned tragically on September 11th. We are opposed by Osama bin Laden and religious fanatics who are prepared to engage in a kind of warfare that we have never experienced before. I agree with Brent Scowcroft, Republican former National Security Advisor for President George Bush Sr., who stated, and I quote, "An attack on Iraq at this time would seriously jeopardize, if not destroy, the global counterterrorist campaign we have undertaken," end quote. Fourth, at a time when this country has a $6 trillion national debt and a growing deficit, we should be clear that a war and a long-term American occupation of Iraq could be extremely expensive. Fifth, I am concerned about the problems of so-called unintended consequences. Who will govern Iraq when Saddam Hussein is removed? And what role will the U.S. play in an ensuing civil war that could develop in that country? Will moderate governments in the region who have large Islamic fundamentalist populations be overthrown and replaced by extremists? Will the bloody conflict between Israel and the Palestinian Authority be exacerbated? And these are just a few of the questions that remain unanswered. If a unilateral American invasion of Iraq is not the best approach, what should we do? In my view, the U.S. must work with the United Nations to make certain, within clearly defined timelines, that the UN inspectors are allowed to do their jobs. These inspectors should undertake an unfettered search for Iraqi weapons of mass destruction and destroy them when found, pursuant to past UN resolutions. If Iraq resists inspection and elimination of stockpiled weapons, we should stand ready to assist the UN in enforcing compliance. I thank the gentleman.
I don't think it can be either or. Now, you know, I voted for the Iraqi resolution, and it was a very difficult vote for me. No, you know,
why don't you, straight. Good. off without Saddam Hussein in power?
Look, I know that there have been a lot of questions about Iraq posed to candidates over the last weeks. I've made it very clear that I made a mistake, plain and simple. And I have written about it in my book. I've talked about it in the past. And, you know, what we now see is a very different and very dangerous situation. The United States is doing what it can, but ultimately this has to be a struggle that the Iraqi government and the Iraqi people are determined to win for themselves.
Let me ask you this about some domestic issues in New York State. This state's always the sort of the social beginnings of so much of this country. People come here, a lot of immigrants. The New York Times recently began posting the celebrations of gay unions. Not just straight people getting married, but gay people who want to announce their unions. Do you think New York State should recognize gay marriage?
No.
No. Okay. Would you, let's talk about it.
I believe that marriage is not just a bond, but a sacred bond between a man and a woman.
I want someone who is qualified, and I feel like when you're talking about, if I look at all the other candidates,
right,
someone who is for rights across the board, equal rights for women, equal rights for every ethnicity, equal rights for everyone, it is the only person I can look at is you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Well, you know.
Is there any shocking doubt? The same people that would vote to cut defense $177 billion, the same ones that would put homos in the military, the same ones that would not fund BRAC, the same ones that would not clear up. No, I will not. Sit down, you socialist.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yield.
The committee will
the ludicrousy of
Mr.
this, even
the
to
committee
appeal
will be in
this.
order, and the gentleman will suspend. The gentleman from Vermont.
I wonder if I could question the gentleman from California. I am rising in support of the amendment.
The chair is in charge. The chair is speaking. The gentleman from Vermont has been recognized for a period of 5 minutes, and you may now proceed.
I thank the chairman very much. I would like the opportunity, if the gentleman from California would respond, just to ask him a brief question, if I might. Now, my ears may have been playing a trick on me, but I thought I heard the gentleman a moment ago say something, quote unquote, about homos in the military. Was I right in hearing that expression?
Absolutely. Putting homosexuals in the military.
You said something about homos in the military. Was the gentleman referring to the many thousands and thousands of gay people who have put their lives on the line in countless wars defending this country? Was that the group of people that the gentleman was referring to?
I'm talking about the military. People in the military do not support.
That's not what we were talking about. You used the word homos in the military. You have insulted thousands of men and women who have put their lives on the line.
I'm talking about you and liberals like you that keep the foreign defense.
Gentlemen.
Reclaiming my time. I go out to high schools all over the state of Vermont. I go to the conservative parts of the state, and I ask the kids, I said, raise your hand. Tell me what you think about gay marriage. And kids kind of shrug their shoulders, and they say, what are you talking about? What is the big deal? Which is exactly what we've always wanted in the first place. What is the big deal? All right? The point is that when millions of people stand up and fight, they win. That's it. And when people do not stand up and fight, we lose.
We've got to do several things, and I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants. I made this exception basically on humanitarian grounds because of the individual stories, but certainly we've got to do more at our borders, and people have to stop employing illegal immigrants. Come up to Westchester, go to Suffolk and Nassau counties, stand in the street corners in Brooklyn or the Bronx. You're going to see loads of people waiting to get picked up to go do yard work and construction work and domestic work.
I think the people who are here, who are raising families and working hard and contributing to our country, deserve a path to citizenship. I have believed that for many years. I have argued that in many different contexts.
I rise this afternoon to say a few words about the immigration reform bill that, as I understand it, we will begin discussing next week. And as the son of an immigrant, somebody who came to this country at the age of 17 without a nickel in his pocket and who was able to send his 2 kids to college, needless to say, I support
immigration. Our country is unique in the world. Our country is great because, in fact, we are the sons and daughters of immigrants, and I think we should all be very proud of that.
And this is a really serious issue. We have more people in jail today than any other country on earth. You all know that? We have large numbers of lives that have been destroyed because of this war on drugs and because people, were caught smoking marijuana and so forth. I think we have got to end the war on drugs. And, looking at what's going on in Colorado and elsewhere, but I am not unfavorably disposed to moving toward the legalization of marijuana.
Would you? It's been more than a year since you said that. Are you ready to take a position tonight?
No. I think that we have the opportunity through the states that are pursuing recreational marijuana to find out a lot more than we know today. I do support the use of medical marijuana, and I think even there we need to do a lot more research so that we know exactly how we're going to help people for whom medical marijuana provides relief. So I think we're just at the beginning, but I agree completely with the idea that we have got to stop imprisoning people who use marijuana. Therefore, we need more states, cities, and the federal government to begin to address this so that we don't have this terrible result that Senator Sanders was talking about, where we have a huge population in our prisons for nonviolent, low-level offenses that are primarily due to marijuana.
Secretary Clinton, thank you.
You tell a story that, to me, illustrates what has happened to our political system in regard to the middle class, in regard to democracy in the country as a whole, and it involves Hillary Clinton.
I had written an op-ed about a piece of pending bankruptcy legislation. The credit card companies have been pushing to try to tighten the bankruptcy laws, sort of like locking the doors to the hospitals and then claiming nobody's sick in America. So they were trying to get the bankruptcy laws constricted, so that fewer families could get in. Why? Because you can make more money if those families don't go into bankruptcy, if you're a credit lender. Mrs. Clinton evidently saw...
The First Lady.
The First Lady. She was then First Lady. This is in the 1990s, late 1990s. Mrs. Clinton saw the piece, and I got a call from the White House. And they said Mrs. Clinton was going to be in town to give a speech in Boston, and would I come and meet with her? I said, sure. And so I put together all my files. I show up at the appointed place. After she's finished her speech, we're ushered into a tiny little room somewhere in the bowels of this hotel, and just the two of us. They close the door. Mrs. Clinton sits down. We have hamburgers and French fries.
And you tutor her.
And she says, tell me about bankruptcy. And I got to tell you, I never had a smarter student. Quick, right to the heart of it. I go over the law. It's a complex law. Went over the economics, showed her the graphs, showed her the charts, and she got it. Within 20 minutes, she could play where the rest of it would come. Well, then that will mean this part's happened. That will mean this has happened. I said, yes, that's right. And at the end of the conversation, Mrs. Clinton stood up. She said, let's get our picture taken, which we did. And she said, Professor Warren, we've got to stop that awful bill, referring to this bankruptcy bill that's sponsored by the credit card companies. And when Mrs. Clinton came back with a little better understanding of how it all worked, they reversed course, and they reversed course fast. And indeed, the proof is in the pudding. The last bill that came before President Clinton was that bankruptcy bill that was passed by the House and the Senate in 2000, and he vetoed it. And in her autobiography, Mrs. Clinton took credit for that veto, and she rightly should. She turned around a whole administration on the subject of bankruptcy. She got it.
And then?
One of the first bills that came up after she was Senator Clinton was the bankruptcy bill. This is a bill that's like a vampire. It will not die, right? There's a lot of money behind it. And
bill her husband had vetoed.
Her husband had vetoed it very much at her urging.
And?
She voted in favor of it.
Why?
As Senator Clinton, the pressures are very different. It's a well-financed industry. A lot of people don't realize that the industry that gave the most money to Washington over the past few years was not the oil industry, was not pharmaceuticals, it was consumer credit products. Those are the people, the credit card companies have been giving money, and they have influence.
And Mrs. Clinton was one of them, as senator. Yeah.
She has taken money from the groups, and more to the point, she worries about them as a constituency.
So what does this mean, though, to these people, these millions of people out there whom the politicians cavort in front of as favoring the middle class and then are beholden to the powerful interests that undermine the middle class? What does it say about politics today?
You know, this is the scary part about democracy today. We're talking again about the impact of money. The credit industry on this bankruptcy bill has spent tens of millions of dollars lobbying, and as their profits grow, they just throw more into lobbying for how they can get laws that will make it easier and easier and easier to drain money out of the pockets of middle-class families.
When this country was founded, only white male property owners over age 21 could vote, but people fought to change that, and we became a more inclusive democracy. After the Civil War, we amended the Constitution to allow non-white men to vote. We became a more inclusive democracy. In 1920, after years of struggle and against enormous opposition, we finally ratified the 19th Amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote. We became a more inclusive democracy. In 1965, under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. and other great heroes, the civil rights movement finally succeeded in outlawing racism at the ballot box, and LBJ signed the Voting Rights Act. We became a more inclusive democracy. 1 year after that, the Supreme Court ruled that the poll tax was unconstitutional, that people could not be denied the right to vote because they were low income. We became a more inclusive democracy. In 1971, young people throughout the country were saying, we're being drafted to go to Vietnam and get killed, but we're 18 and we don't have the right to vote. We passed the constitutional amendment. The voting age was lowered to 18. We became a more inclusive democracy. Mr. Chairman, the democratic foundations of our country and this movement toward a more inclusive democracy are now facing the most severe attacks, both economically and politically, that we have seen in the modern history of the United States. Tragically, and I say these words advisedly, we are well on our way to seeing our great country move toward an oligarchic form of government where virtually all economic and political power rests with a handful of very wealthy families. Citizens United is a part of that process, and that is a trend we must reverse. Economically, the United States today has by far the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth, and that inequality is worse today than it was in any time since the late 1920s. One family, the Walton family of Walmart fame, owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people. Bottom 60% own less than 2% of the wealth. Top 1% owns 40% of the wealth. Now, that is what is going on economically in this country. A handful of billionaires own a significant part of the wealth of America and have enormous control over our economy. What the Supreme Court did in Citizens United is say to these same billionaires, you own and control the economy, you own Wall Street, you own the coal companies, you own the oil companies. Now, for a very small percentage of your wealth, we're going to give you the opportunity to own the United States government. That is the essence of what Citizens United is all about, and that is why it must be overturned. Let us be clear.
Why should we be surprised that one family worth $50 billion is prepared to spend $400 million in this election to protect their interest? That is a small investment for them and a good investment. But it is not just the Koch brothers. Mr. Chairman, there are at least 23 billionaire families who have contributed a minimum of $250,000 each into the political process up to now during this campaign. And my guess is that number is really much greater because many of these contributions are made in secret. In other words, not content to own our economy, the 1% want to own our government as well. The constitutional amendment that Congressman Ted Deutsch and I have introduced states the following. For-profit corporations are not people and are not entitled to any rights under the Constitution. For-profit corporations are entities of the states and are subject to regulation by the legislatures of the states so long as the regulations do not limit the freedom of the press. For-profit corporations are prohibited from making contributions or expenditures into political campaigns. Congress and the states have the right to regulate and limit all political expenditures and contributions, including those made by a candidate. I am proud to say that the American people are making their voices heard on this issue. You got over close to 2 million signatures right there on a petition. In my state of Vermont, we have seen dozens and dozens of towns go on record as saying they support a constitutional amendment, and we have 6 states having done the same. You have some very good amendments here with Senator Baucus, Senator Udall, and Congresswoman Edwards. I hope we move on this issue because the future of American democracy is at stake. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Senator Sanders.
Well, I think that the laws that were passed, again, post 9/11, gave very broad authority. And that authority was passed by the Congress, and it was endorsed by executives in 2 administrations, both Bush and Obama.
Mayor Bernard Sanders of Burlington, Vermont, how does a socialist like yourself keep winning elections in a country we generally consider that has a 2-party system?
Well, I think we win in Burlington. I should point out that in Burlington, I am the mayor, and I've won on 4 occasions, but we have 13 people on our city council, our Board of Aldermen, and 6 of them are progressive, so it's not just me. We have probably the only strong 3-party city in the United States of America. And I think the reason that we win and continue to win is that increasingly, people are frustrated and angry about a 2-party system which is dominated by big money and which does not pay attention to the needs of working people or elderly people or poor people. And I think if you talk common sense to the people and you say the government is supposed to represent the needs of those people who today are not getting a fair shake, you know what? They'll vote for you. And the problem that we have nationally in this country is that the 2-party system, dominated by big money, is not delivering for ordinary people, which is why people are giving up on the political process, why they're not voting, and why there is a great deal of anger and frustration at the political system as it now exists.